Welcome to Chapter 10. Chapter 10 talks about minorities and people maybe on the fringes of society and people who otherwise oftentimes don't get included in the conversation. The chapter is named Disparate Populations, which when I first saw that I was like, is that an appropriate term to refer to people? And so I did some research and apparently it is. It just kind of refers to people who are difficult to categorize or difficult rather to compare. That's the issue. It's hard to compare one to the other. So there's just minority and disparate are probably synonyms in this sense. So let's get started. So what are the objectives of this chapter? We want to explain the role of social determinants of health. Those are things like income and age and education in health disparities. So what is the relationship between your income and your health outcomes and disparities, which is like, one person has more than another person or another group really. Explain the concept of diversity as it refers to health equity in the United States. Discuss the impact of a more diverse population in the United States on community and public health efforts. Discuss selected socio-demographic characteristics of disparate groups in the United States. Socio-demographics is just social things like education and income and how they're getting along with other groups. List the 6 priorities of the Health and Race Initiative and then define the concepts within multicultural competence. That relates to how can we use this to improve things in the United States. All right, in the United States, one of our strengths lies in the fact that we are one of the most diverse countries in the world. I think we are the most, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But if you think about what makes us great, it's the fact that we have people who come from all over the world, and they bring different ideas than the people who are already here. And so that looks like yummy things like different restaurants, but it also looks like different ways of thinking about business and different ways of doing family, and we are actually much richer for that because some of those new ideas really set us ahead of countries rather that are much more like the word is like homogeneous, but much more like the same, while they have typically less conflict than we do, because with that diversity comes different ideas, and sometimes there's a clash between those ideas, between those people groups. It also is a strength because, we get lots of different ways of doing things. All right, we're going to talk about minority health in this chapter, and minority health is going to refer to the morbidities, the mortalities, and research shows that minorities have poorer health in general. A couple of exceptions. But health disparity is just that difference between people groups, right? And so, for example, non-Hispanic whites have a life expectancy, at least at birth, of about 79 years compared to blacks, which is about 75 years. So that difference is referred to as the health disparity between those two groups. All right, the Health and Race Initiative. The goal of the government and other professional and community health organizations is to eliminate that difference. You are going to have difference among people. Some people are going to live longer, some people are going to have more disease, but it shouldn't be along racial or ethnic lines, right? So diving deeper in that, what are the specific goals in eliminating the difference? So infant mortality, how many infants die before they reach 1 year old? Cancer screenings and management, cardiovascular disease and stroke, number of people who have diabetes, the number of people who have HIV, the number of children and adults who get immunized. All right, so what creates health disparities between people groups? Well, there's a strong association between the social determinants. That would be things like income and education and, well, those are the main ones that we can focus on. You could also focus on how often people go to the doctor and other things like that. The more education people have, the better their health outcomes. Maybe that's because education is teaching people things about their health. Maybe it's because people that are getting more education naturally have a more long-term view of their future. Maybe the same people who are able to go on to get an education are the same people who have time and money to be able to take care of their health. But either way, the more education somebody has, the better their health outcomes are going to be, on average, of course. So there's always exceptions. The level of income, typically the more somebody has money, they can afford to go to the doctor, to have health screenings, to go to the gym, to eat fruits and vegetables, right? And then, you could even step it up even more, and you could say they have the money to go get massages on a regular basis, which are proved to help us. They have money to take vacations in health resorts and visit therapists and things like that people in poverty typically don't have. In 2016, 61% of Americans identify as white, non-Hispanic. By 2060, over half the population will be identified as some racial identity other than white. Okay? That makes it even more important to eliminate the disparity between whites and other groups. I think it's already important, but as the number increases, it's even more imperative. You have even more people who are suffering under this, being less healthy. Okay, now the solutions are unfortunately not so simple, because it's not just, oh, well, have people who are non-white go to the doctor more often, right? Because it's not just going to the doctor that makes people healthy. It's the social determinants of health, things like income, things like education, right? Those things are a lot harder to achieve equality in. We've been working on that for decades now. And so that, unfortunately, that makes it harder because even studies show that even when African Americans go to the doctor, even if the doctors themselves are African American, they're not treated the same as their white counterparts. Right? So, and then the solutions for one group may not be the same as a solution for another, because the people groups are different, and so one could argue that they have to be kind of custom tailored for different groups. So one group may have a lot more distrust of the healthcare system than another group, and so the solution has to be, keeping that in mind. Let's talk about race and ethnic classifications. These are used to group large numbers of people together and realize that they are flexible. They've changed throughout time based upon political issues and social issues. So just because, today an Irish person would be considered white doesn't mean that in the past they were considered white. So that's why it talks about, it's just really like it's more of a social category than it is a biological category, right? Now, race is based upon physical appearance, hair texture, facial shape, the amount of melanin in our skin. Whereas ethnicity is really about a subculture. It's really more cultural, people's religion and their dress and where they come from. Now, one of the things to realize is that it's not a perfect science in terms of collecting information about race and ethnicity, because some people will report one thing in one form and then write another thing in another form. Some people will leave it blank, and So it's not always the most reliable thing. Also, again, to reiterate that these are social constructions and they change over time. And you may be one race and ethnicity in one country and another in another country. If I were to go back a couple hundred years, I would not have been considered white, but today I would be. And so, realize that there's kind of all these sort of things that kind of fit in. That's why sometimes you'll see very different numbers about how many whites are today in the United States versus another study that's a little bit different. So one of the goals is to have more reliable data so that you can track trends related to like how much progress are we making. Let's talk about Americans of Hispanic origin. The term Hispanic is not a race. I oftentimes mix this up. It's actually an ethnicity. It refers to people who come from countries that have been either invaded by Spain or speak Spanish, the Spanish language. So that's going to include Mexico and many of the Central American countries and most of the South American countries and some of the ones in the Caribbean as well. It's also going to include Spain, because that is it's a culture, right? It's language, is a culture. It's not a race. So somebody can be African. They can be African Hispanic or Hispanic African, I guess. Because African is a race, but that refers to like the biological features that we refer to as African race, but it's going to refer to the cultural aspects that refer to Hispanic. So they are the largest minority group in the United States. They have been growing and they surpassed African Americans I think about 10 years ago. So in terms of people groups within the United States, people of Mexico are the largest Hispanic group, followed by I think Puerto Rico and Cuba. Ecuador are have large representations here in the United States. I have a slide that refers to the income, I believe. No, this is education. So educational attainment, as you can see right here, Hispanic, large numbers of them do not have a high school diploma, 45%. 19% high school graduates, 23% some college, and then 13% college graduates or higher. This is back from 2018. I imagine the reason why there's a lot of them that are have 45% is because it refers more of them are immigrants from other countries. However, there is an asterisk here that says that there may be some statistical differences, and so the confidence level is not as strong. So this is going to go away. No, it's not. Okay, let's look at incomes. And I know I'm covering up some of the thing, but I think you can see most of it. In terms of incomes, Hispanics have been growing from 2014 to 2015, significant gains there. However, whites are significantly higher if you compare the 2014 figure of Hispanics at 42,500 to the whites of 60,300. There's a pretty significant income disparity between those two groups. And then this is going to go away, but it's not. So, all right, forgive my lack of PowerPoint slides here. Let's talk about some cultural terms. Hispanic culture tends to be more collective, which means that it is going to put more emphasis on the collective view, maybe of someone's personal life. So if I was a collectivist, or the term that our book refers to as collectivismo, I am going to prioritize the group's belief about what should happen in society or what should happen even in my personal life, perhaps more so than I would even my personal opinion about what should happen in my life. There's more of a belief in fatalism, which referred to as fatalismo. This is a belief that life is going to do what it's going to do with or without my input, And so the nice part of that is there's a little bit less anxiety because I don't feel like the whole weight of my life exists on my shoulders or even on my group's shoulders. It's just going to kind of, life's going to go the way it's going to go. Machismo is just beliefs about gender and way that men should act, whereas Marianismo is a term that's going to be referred to as or is going to refer to the ways that women should act, so your kind of your gender roles. And Hispanic culture tends to have traditional gender beliefs. Men should be the one pursuing women. Men should be the ones out making money. Women should be at home with children and things like that. So, health beliefs. More of an emphasis on traditional healing, on the fact that things, maybe bad health outcomes are a result of curses or things that someone has done bad in their life. Okay, let's talk about African Americans. This is referring to a racial group associated with African ancestry, but not all African Americans trace their roots back to the African continent. Realize that a racial group has just biological features that are associated with the continent that it comes from. So anyway, they are the second largest minority group in the United States. About half of them live in southern states. Let's skip education and income for the moment. Let's talk about the impact of slavery. Slavery existed in this country for a couple of hundred years. It was outlawed in 1865. Obviously, enslavement did not allow people to pursue health and have access to health care. But even after slavery ended, laws were created to create second-class citizens out of African Americans. This includes segregation. You'd have clinics that were serving the whites and clinics that were serving blacks, and receiving inferior care and lack of research on African Americans. And the Civil Rights Movement really formally ended the legalized Jim Crow laws in the 1960s. But that, today, if you look at how people pay for healthcare, which is very expensive, way more expensive in this country than in any other country in the world, health insurance pays for much of our care. Many African Americans don't have jobs that provide good health care, and so those health disparities remain. Right? Now, let me just clarify. I'm not saying that the majority of African Americans don't have health insurance. It's just that there's more African Americans that don't have health insurance compared to whites. And to fill in the gap that formalized health care did not provide for African Americans during slavery, during segregation, there was alternative medicine or traditional medicines that would have been used. Those, the reliance on those still exists today, right? In addition to this, there were experiments that were done on African Americans, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which some African Americans were purposefully not treated for syphilis, which kind of cemented in many people's mind the idea that the healthcare system cannot be trusted. And so today, when you look at why African American communities don't receive, say, health vaccines, many times they'll point to times in the past where the healthcare system was actively working against African Americans to kind of cement that distrust in it. So, health beliefs, again, oftentimes a little bit more in believing in the traditional healthcare or traditional alternative health methods, herbs, and prayers related to health. So I actually think there's actually a large movement toward that in our culture today, probably for the same reasons, is that the fact that it's so expensive has excluded many people from the healthcare systems, and so alternative health, which is typically a little bit more cheaper, certainly more cheap than surgery or cancer treatments, has driven many people to alternative health, and other reasons too. All right, look at this. My chart worked. Looking at what is this? Lower educational attainments. About 27% of African Americans have less than a high school diploma, 31% have only a high school degree, diploma, I guess. 29% have some college, and then 12% have college degree or higher. Obviously, that's significantly less compared to the whites, but more so than Hispanics, at least when it comes to high school graduation. All right. This chart looks at income, right? And again, why are we looking at income? Well, there's a direct connection or correlation between the amount of money that somebody earns and their health outcomes. And so if you compare whites and blacks, at every education level, blacks are making less than their white counterparts. Right? Let's look at Asian Americans as a group. This is a racial group that we're talking about, although we're going to be talking about some of the specific ethnicities here. So Asian Americans are people who trace their roots to more than 20 different Asian countries. So this is going to include Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, Pacific Islanders and their descendants, as well as people from Japan and Korea and China and India and Vietnam, places like that. So looking at immigration, you saw a large number of immigrants coming from China in the 1800s, the gold mines of San Francisco, and then the cross-continental railroads being built, although we banned them back in the 1800s. But then many Japanese came over and settled in the West Coast. And so their educational attainment tends to be higher than the rest of the population of the United States. I've got a slide here. Even though their educational attainment is higher, it's not that all of them have a bachelor's degree or a doctor, or there are doctors. In fact, if you look at the different groups, some of them have a lot less than average. If you look at Laotians as compared to the average is 32%. 32% of the people in the United States have I think it's a bachelor's degree or higher. Laotians, it's half that. If you look at Indians as a group, it's 3 times that almost have a bachelor's degree or higher. And so, the idea of a model minority is that Asians are just doing so well because they have higher education, they have higher incomes, they have lower crime, they're longer life, and things like that. But it's not equal. There are some people groups that are doing a lot better, specifically the Chinese and the Indians, but other groups that are doing a lot poorer when it comes to at least education. So. Religious backgrounds, there are several different religions that are practiced by people who are Asian Americans. You've got a large number of Christians in specifically South Korea. You have more like Buddhist and Shintos in Japan. China is kind of officially an atheist country, but that doesn't mean there's not lots of practicing people there. You have Islamic people coming from, there's one country that's considered the model, a Muslim country, and I think that's not Bangladesh, but anyway, one of the islands that's south of Vietnam. So anyway, a lot of different religious backgrounds, and those are going to impact health because many of those incorporate different health practices related to the religion. Health beliefs are a little bit different from kind of your traditional Western belief. You know, in the West, traditionally, we've kind of separated the mind from the body, and it's more about isolating the issue in the body. You know, if we're having like a liver problem, then our medicine is going to focus on the liver, right? That kind of seems obvious to many of us, but it doesn't. You know, our body is a complete whole, and so while it may seem like that's really where the issue is, the liver is connected to the heart and all the other parts of the body. And so Asian culture is going to focus on harmony throughout the body with the idea that, yes, it's showing up in the liver, but that's just the manifestation. And so we don't want to just treat the symptom. We want to get to the root, and the root is an imbalance in the body. There's too much stress, there's too much, moisture or too much heat or things of that nature. So I oftentimes think that way of looking at it is very beneficial to prevent health issues, whereas Western medicine is very good at dealing with a specific health issue. Like if you break your arm, it's good to go to a Western doctor. But if you're feeling fatigued and restless overall, maybe more of a traditional Asian health practice would be more beneficial. American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Right? So these are the original people of North, South, and Central America. Going back a minute to talking about people from South America, today most Hispanics, they are a combination racially of American Indians and Europeans. So that is kind of visually, what they look like. And so that's maybe why we don't categorize Hispanics or Latinos as a separate racial group, because it's sort of a combination. And so someone could be, like living in Peru, which is in South America, but they are racially, they're an Indian, although they probably call them indigenous people groups. We do the same thing sometimes in the United States. Or they could be somebody who is from Spain and has not, they have not, mated with people from South America, and so their race would be white. Anyway, going back to this slide here, there are many different American Indian tribal groups in Alaskan villages, each with distinct customs, languages, and beliefs. So when I think of Indians, I may think of a teepee and tomahawks. The reality is that's just maybe categorized as just a couple of the tribes, which have very different cultures and belief systems and languages and foods. And unfortunately, they have relatively poor health status compared to the larger group in the United States. The Indian Health Services is responsible for 574 tribes, and so this is going to include building hospitals and maintaining those clinics and health stations that service them. You might ask, why is their health status pretty poor? Again, if we go back to those health indicators, what goes along with health? Typically income and education, and unfortunately that is oftentimes pretty low among these people groups. All right, Middle Eastern and North African Americans, they are not considered a unique racial group according to the US government. They're actually typically classified as white, maybe some other race. There is great within group and between group variations. When people think about people from the Middle East, oftentimes maybe they think about a person who's a Muslim, and they may think about a certain style of dress and a certain skin tone. But there's a lot of different religions, a lot of different languages. Just to give you a personal example, my neighbor is Iranian, and when I met him, my initial thought was, oh, you're probably Muslim. You probably speak Arabic. Didn't speak Arabic. They speak Farsi. in Iran, and he was not Muslim, he was Jewish, and I was very surprised about that. And I was like, oh, there probably is not very many Jewish people in Iran. Well, wrong again. He's like, actually, there's more Jewish people in Iran than any other country other than, I think, Israel. Right? Maybe there were more people who were Jewish in Iran because Israel's a fairly small country compared to Iran. So it's easy to kind of stereotype these people groups, but it's hard to do that. It's hard to make broad statements about people from this pretty varied and definitely very old culturally area. All right, let's talk about other diverse populations, moving away from race and geography. LGBTQ plus, right? Those populations can have varying health outcomes compared to the rest of the population. So typically among these populations, there are higher depression and other mental health issues, typically poorer as well. Can be as much or more variation within the groups as between groups. Okay. So looking at people based upon their sexual orientation. And so this would be who people are attracted to or how they identify their sexual orientation, as well as their gender identity. And then their gender expression. So when you look at LGB, those are lesbian, gay, bisexual, right? That's going to refer to sexual orientation. But T refers to transgender, which is about gender identity. Q refers to as queer, and so it's anybody outside of the heterosexual heterosexual cisgender, which is going to, when people they're identifying with the sex that they were born with. And then plus is just the other groups like two-spirited and asexual. Intersectionality looks at how race and class and gender and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. And so rather than just looking at one, say, minority status, like somebody's race and how that affects them alone, what if the person has a racial status that is disempowered and a class status that is disempowered, right? So the example here is a black lesbian woman. Well, those are three statuses that typically are all prejudiced against. So they're resulting in people having less power. And so it's almost a multiplier for this individual having all three of those. So this is important to assess, plan, and implement and evaluate individual and community programming and policy efforts. Because typically when people want to plan an effort, they choose one identity, like how do we help African Americans, or how do we help people who are of this maybe religious group that are receiving, poor health outcomes, or the gender identity, or somebody who's not speaking English as their native language. And so it identifies one of those identifiers and focuses on that without realizing that people don't just have one identity that puts them maybe behind the eight ball. Maybe they have multiple ones, and so treating the individual as a whole. Looking at a group of people who oftentimes get the short end of the stick because they are new or they're in transition from one place to another, immigrants and refugees. Refugees are a specific type of immigrant who are fleeing one country due to war or political persecution, whereas an immigrant may be moving for economic opportunities or because their family is there. And the difference being that immigrants typically have more time to prepare. They may be better able to have access to their money and their important documents, whereas refugees may be leaving in a hurry, maybe leaving overnight, and maybe fleeing for their lives and aren't able to go back. So they can be, obviously they have a racial and an ethnic group that they can be categorized in, or they can be thought of as just a group in general. So if a health program is targeting them, it may not be thinking about the racial or the ethnic groups, but it might just be saying, how do we help all immigrants? However, if all of the immigrants are coming from a specific country, it might be helpful to think about, for instance, Syrian refugees as a group. They're going to be having, unique ethnic characteristics, and so you can kind of plan that program to tailor to them. All right, let's talk about how to become multiculturally competent. And this is important because if you want to be effective in reaching out to a group, especially if that group is not the group where you come from, you're going to want to be able to competently engage with them, and that oftentimes has to do with trust. And that's not something that you can just say, like, I can say, oh, trust me, but I'm going to be communicating that through my body language. I'm going to be communicating that through the way I hold myself when I'm around that person. Do I make eye contact? Do I not make eye contact? How do I talk to people, given that they have a racial identity, I have a racial identity, they may have a religious identity, I may have a religious. And so kind of all those things kind of come together, when you're interacting with somebody that's not of the same culture as you. So what is bias? A bias is a form of prejudice that is typically against one person or one people group. We can be aware of it, right? Or we can be not aware of it. I think typically in the United States, because it is not considered appropriate anymore to be racist or to be prejudiced, we don't like to think of ourselves in those terms, but we may still have them, but we maybe kind of like shut that away because only bad people are prejudiced or biased, that sort of thing. So, all right. So how do we manage implicit bias? Maybe a bias that we're not even really aware of in ourselves. And so I think the first step is just to acknowledge that we have certain biases. We have associations. When we see people who dress a certain way or who talk a certain way, who believe a certain way, we have biases and we kind of categorize them. And so they always say, that acknowledging it is the first step. And then challenge those negative biases. If you think, you could start with something that's relatively common, like elderly people. Typically people have ageism and they're pretty comfortable, believing in those things. But all right, so if you say, okay, well, I have this bias against people who are elderly, you say, all right, well, let's try to challenge those negative beliefs. Are there people who don't follow your bias? So if you have this idea that elderly people are slower, all right, well, are there any fast people that that are elderly? Well, there are people who are 80 and 90 and who are running marathons, right? So things like that about saying, all right, well, so in my head these type of people do this way, or are there exceptions? And I'm going to go looking for those things, right? Now this is tough because typically we like to think of ourselves in really positive terms, and we don't really like to acknowledge the fact that we have these beliefs, even though we typically see them in other people, and we typically get upset when we see those. So being empathetic. How can I see the world through someone else's eyes? Especially if I'm the health professional and they're walking into my office, kind of looking at my office, my surroundings, the way I hold myself, and how might they experience me. So seeing the differences, what is different about them than is different about me, right? Trying to be an ally, how can I help them in the way that they can receive it? I know how I'd receive it, right? I might appreciate these things being given to me in a certain way, but they may not receive it in the same way. So realizing that it's tough, it's not always easy to acknowledge difference. It's not always easy to stick up for a people group. but you are really powerful in the people groups that you hang around with and that you know. And so challenging people when they say things that are biased, right? You know, this is tough. I think you kind of got to figure out your own way of doing this. You know, I try not to get overly upset when I hear people say it, because I think it's better that I want people to be real around me so that we can find the truth. If people feel like I'm unsafe for them to be themselves, then they're going to be very closed off. So I think that communicating, even bias, is better. I guess I'm not okay with them just, being okay with, being biased and having no desire to change. I guess that's a balance there. Like, you want people to be open to where they're at, but you also don't want them to be comfortable being biased, being prejudiced. And so, anyway, you want to be able to point out to them, hey, that's the truth is that this, so I mean, even comments that I see about, oh, they're not Asian, they're just normal. That's an opportunity to say, you mean they're not white? Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. Sorry. That's typically the way that interaction goes. You're able to point out and not making a huge deal out of it, but just saying, when you say normal, what you're implying is that people who are Asian are not normal, something like that. So, engaging in dialogue with people who are from a different culture than you, engaging in dialogue with people from your same culture about these issues. I think this is a path forward. Culturally and linguistically competent, right? We work with people that we trust, and so if you are working with somebody from a different culture than you, understanding the language that they use, being able to understand and appreciate kind of the history behind their interactions with the system, which, if you're working in the healthcare system, you will be a part of that system, it is really helpful, right? Intercultural communication. Working with people that you have an intercultural relationship with, meaning you're part of the same culture as them, working with people who you are part of a different culture than them, but you're in the same country, right? So this would be like, whites with Asian Americans, right? And then cross-culturally, this would be maybe with an immigrant from another country. They're now in the United States, and you being a native, I guess not Native American, but you're somebody who has been born in the United States, and so this would be an example of cross-cultural. So this is a good place to point out that learning a foreign language is a real blessing and a job enhancement. It gives you the ability to interact with people that otherwise there might be a real barrier between. All right, empowering the self and the community. You want people to be able to have the most amount of power that they can, right? To empower somebody is to help somebody take more power in their own life. And so there's 3 types of power that are outlined here. Social power, or social empowerment, refers to the ability to gain access to information. Where are health clinics? Where are schools? Where are hospitals? If I wanted to learn how to fix my car, how do I gain that? So that's needed in order to gain political power, which is about having a people group's voice heard. Politicians typically pay attention to people groups that they feel are going to vote for them or against them, and oftentimes people on the margins, poor people, don't vote, and so politicians oftentimes Don't give them much, don't act on their behalf because they don't hear from them and they're not voting in the polls. So psychological power is kind of the third power, and that is the individual sense of I can do this. I am powerful in my own life and also in my community, and I can make a change. We can make a change for impacting our lives individually and collectively. The idea that most of the time what holds us back is our own inability to believe that we can do it. All right, that is the end of this chapter.